So what I want to go through with you all is just a little bit of background in mutations. And they mentioned mutations in that last video. And what I want you to understand is there are a couple different ways that mutations can happen. A lot of times we think about mutations in sort of a like action movie, right? Like mutations is Spider-Man, or we think about it in terms of like some horrible thing like, oh, there was a mutation and now everything, you know, somebody's suffering, or there's death and destruction. And the reality is mutation is much more straightforward than that, and the implications of mutation are more complicated than that. Essentially, what we're looking at is one small piece of mutations, and that piece is, where does variation come from? I told you the other day that for natural selection to happen, we need to make sure that we start with variation. If there isn't a variation in phenotype for organisms, then there's nothing for natural selection to act on. If every single organism has the exact same genotype, the same alleles, the same DNA sequences, then none of those organisms are going to be more fit because of their genetic makeup. They're going to have the exact same biological fitness genetically. If we start with one cell, like a bacterial cell, to keep it simple, and that cell divides, then it will have, those two daughter cells will have the same DNA that the original parent cell had. If each of those cells divides, then the 4 daughter cells will have the same DNA that the parent cell had. If we keep dividing over and over and over and over and over again, we never get new DNA. So the question is, where does that come from? And the answer is, well, it can come from a couple of different places. Both of these places we call mutations, okay? So one source of mutations is that there can be errors when cells replicate. So to keep things simple, I'm going to talk about a cell, and we're going to just ignore whether it's a diploid or a haploid cell, whether it's a bacteria or a multicellular organism. We're just going to look at one cell, and we're just going to look at one chromosome within that cell. So when cells divide, part of the cell cycle is the M phase, in which the DNA is replicated. And if we were to look at the DNA replication here, every once in a while, there's a mistake, an error in DNA replication. And that error is going to affect one of the 2 new strands of DNA that's produced, the sister chromatids that are hooked together. When this cell divides, the 2 resulting daughter cells are going to have different DNA. So we've gone from one genetic sequence, one sequence of DNA, to 2. And this happens relatively frequently. It happens in single organisms like us. It happens in bacteria. It's not uncommon for replication errors to occur. And we'll talk about where this leads us in just a minute. Okay? So we can get mutations through replication error. We can also get mutations when some sort of a substance interferes with a chromosome and causes it to actually break and then reform in a new way. And so if we have, again, sort of a generic cell, it could be haploid, could be diploid, but we're just looking at one chromosome in that cell. If something hits that chromosome, it could knock loose some of those DNA base pairs. And when the cell repairs them, it might repair them incorrectly. So we can end up with a new sequence of DNA in that cell because something bonked into it. And when that cell divides, then both daughter cells will have the resulting new strand of DNA. And This is caused by something that we call a mutagen. A mutagen is something that can cause DNA to change, either through chemical or energetic interactions. Mutagens are things like radiation. We can cause mutations by aiming ultraviolet or electromagnetic radiation at a cell, and we can cause mutations to develop in the DNA because of that. We can also get cause mutations with chemicals in the environment. And typically, the chemicals that we are exposed to that are natural, that have been around for a long time in nature, are not likely to cause mutations. Our bodies can essentially sort of defend against any potential mutagens that are natural, because we've had thousands of years of evolution to come up with defenses for them. But new chemicals that are made by humans, potentially our bodies have no defense for those. So that's why we're very concerned about toxins in the environment. Chemicals that have ended up in the environment that we might inhale, or we might eat or drink, or we might have exposure to on our skin. Yeah. These kinds of mutations are actually really important scientifically. As it turns out, when we study evolution and natural selection, when we study genetics, one of the things that we need is lots and lots and lots of variation. So scientists, like quite a while ago in the 40s and 50s, discovered that if they use ultraviolet light or X-rays or certain chemicals, they can increase the rate of mutations in organisms like fruit flies. It's tiny little flies that we've all seen them. You've almost certainly had fruit flies in your kitchen at some point. They're the ones that like show up out of nowhere if somebody accidentally leaves a piece of like fruit on the counter and it starts to go bad. Those fruit flies, as it turns out, reproduce really quickly. It's really easy for us to cause genetic mutations. And so a lot of the work that people do in genetics is with fruit flies for that reason. And as an aside, it would be so cool to do a fruit fly study with you all. The problem with fruit flies is that even though they're really easy to look at in the context of a science lab, it's still not super convenient in a classroom. Because in a classroom, it would still take days or even weeks to have generational turnover in the fruit flies, and the work is really tedious. They're tiny, and you have to inspect them under a microscope, so it gets tricky. Yeah?
Does that mean that organisms that reproduce faster evolve faster?
It could be, yeah. So sometimes. You're absolutely right that the more cell divisions that happen, the more likely you are to see mutations, but it works really differently for organisms that reproduce sexually versus mitosis, and it works really differently for organisms that have evolved cellular machinery to potentially deal with these things. In general, though, single-celled organisms like bacteria that reproduce through a process that is very much like mitosis. It's not exactly mitosis, but very similar. It's called binary fission. They do evolve really quickly. We can see evolution happen. We can see mutations develop in bacteria over the course of days. One of the most famous experiments ever done is an experiment that involved bacteria that were exposed to varying levels of antibiotics. And what they did is they took bacteria and they put it in this like nutrient tray that was right next to a nutrient tray that had a bunch of antibiotics in it. And the bacteria grew, but it couldn't expand into the area that had antibiotics until a mutation occurred that resulted in antibiotic resistance. And those mutations, there were many of them that occurred, and then those multiplied, and they took over the second tray that had some antibiotics in it, and that was right next to another tray that had even more antibiotics in it, and that held them off for a while until more mutations occurred. and then bacteria expanded into that one, and then there was even another one. So there were 3 levels of antibiotics, and those bacteria evolved resistance through mutations to those antibiotics in a matter of a few days. So yeah, it's pretty crazy how quickly it can happen. With multicellular organisms, it's different, and one of the reasons that it's different from multicellular organisms is that we have 2 types of cells, just like all multicellular organisms do. One type of cells are non-reproductive. They're also called autosomal. And in these non-reproductive cells, these mutations can happen, but they don't contribute to evolution. They don't contribute to the variation that is potentially heritable, because the mutations are not passed to offspring. So these are super interesting, and one of the things that we see with mutations in non-reproductive cells is that for any one individual, this can be a real problem. Okay, a lot of times it ends up not doing any harm for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about in a second. But this is where we get cancer. So, and this isn't the only thing that can happen with a mutation, but that's the big concern. If you have a cell and a mutation develops, whether it's from a replication error or whether it's from some sort of a mutagen, either way, one possibility is that cell will then start dividing and it won't stop. And that's cancer. Unrestricted cell division is cancer. And what happens is you just get these masses of cells. They're not doing what they're supposed to, and they're taking up space. Those are called tumors. Those tumors can prevent your other cells from functioning correctly. So you can have tumors in organs like your lungs, and those tumors prevent the rest of your cells in your lungs from doing their job. Those tumors can also, little parts of those cells can break free and move around in your bloodstream and get to other parts of your body. And so they can spread. And cancer ends up being a potentially deadly disease, not because the tumors are producing toxins or they're doing, it's not the tumors themselves that are causing problems, it's the unrestricted growth. They just start growing and they take over. They damage organs, they can damage your brain, they can damage your lungs, they can damage your intestinal system. So cancer is basically a mutation that makes cells not know when to quit. They just don't know when to stop growing. What we're interested in right now that has to do with evolution is reproductive cells. And in reproductive cells, which for humans would be sperm and eggs, but in other organisms might look different, but whatever they are, they're the cells that are used to reproduce. If these kinds of mutations happen in the reproductive cells, then these are potentially, oops, that's not how you spell potentially passed to offspring. And at this point, what happens next depends on the nature of the mutation. So these can be neutral, which means really nothing happens. They're there, there's changes in the DNA, but if it's changes to a particular allele, it doesn't change the resulting protein in a way that affects the function. There's a little bit of wiggle room. You can make changes to certain proteins and they still work. Sometimes there's no visible change at all. Other times you get a visible change, but it doesn't affect the organism's fitness. Another thing that can happen is we can have mutations that are harmful. And those harmful mutations can impact reproduction in a few ways. One is the sex cell itself, the gamete, may not be viable. So you might end up with an egg or a sperm that just doesn't work. Another thing that could happen is that the sex cell could work, but when the egg is fertilized, the resulting fertilized egg won't divide correctly. So then you have a non-viable, embryo or fetus. And the other thing that can happen is that the organism can actually be born, but it just has reduced fitness when compared to other organisms. And then where things get really interesting is that sometimes these mutations in gametes can be helpful. And so the resulting organism might have increased fitness as a result of having that particular allele. With diploid organisms like humans, whether a particular mutation is neutral, harmful, or helpful, sometimes we can accumulate those in our DNA, and it can kind of build up in the population, because some places where these neutral mutations show up is in DNA that doesn't do anything. Doesn't do anything at all. No, it's not a gene. No protein is made from that section of DNA. It just seems to be just sort of sitting there. What's interesting about that is that over evolutionary time, millions of years, sometimes those sections of DNA get activated. So we can accumulate mutations that are suddenly turned on when a particular gene through another mutation is activated. And that can result in rapid changes to organisms. The harmful mutations, on the other hand, might be recessive. So what that means is that even if a mutation is harmful, a resulting offspring that has that mutation may also have a dominant allele, and it ends up not being harmful to the organism. It has one allele that would be harmful, but it has another one that's working correctly, and it only needs one. And what's interesting about that is that these harmful alleles then persist in the population. And you'd think, well, that's not great, except remember what we talked about the other day. Environment is part of what determines fitness. If the environment changes, these alleles that may at one point have been harmful might suddenly be beneficial. So keeping those mistakes tucked away ends up being super beneficial for diploid organisms. Yeah. So this is as much as you need to know about mutations. They're mistakes that are made in DNA replication, or mistakes that happen in DNA due to the influence of radiation or chemicals, these mutagens. When that happens, if it happens to a reproductive cell, whether that's a single-celled bacteria or whether that is like an egg and a sperm in a mammal, those mistakes can potentially be passed on to offspring. The vast majority are either neutral or harmful. We don't need that many to be helpful as long as we have a lot of time. And we do have a lot of time. This Earth has been around for many billions of years. Life has existed for billions of years. And in that amount of time, you don't need to have that many helpful mutations show up, like on average per year. You just need enough time for a whole bunch of them to show up. And that's exactly what's happening. So this is as much as you need to know about mutations. This is where the variation comes from, and now we'll see what can happen with the variation.